Urbanization and reforms. How the topic influenced culture, politics, economics, and society in the United States during the Gilded Age. Overview. Urbanization, immigration, and industrialization fostered the significant changes that took place in the United States in late 19th century. These three ideas were interlinked in the sense that they developed simultaneously. Urbanization in this context is a shift in population from rural areas to urban cities. The growth of factories, thanks to the second industrial revolution that took place in the US in the late half of 19th century, had created a huge demand for labor. This convinced people living in rural areas, such as subsistence farmers, artisans, to move into the city, as well as drawing immigrants from Europe to the United States. As a result, the US transformed from an agrarian to a highly industrialized urban nation. As we have mentioned previously, that urbanization and industrialization intertwine with each other. We will first briefly explain how industrialization helped bring about urbanization in America in the Gilded Age. The factors that have contributed to industrialization are: first, America itself was a powerhouse packed with valuable natural resources such as coal, iron ore, lead, oil, etc. How this helped? Well, we could simply skip finding new raw material part by establishing colonies like the British and go straight to the manufacturing process. Second, of course, our immigration had played a part in this. 100,000 immigrants arrived between 1865 to 1900, and a growing population had formed an abundant labor that was needed for the growing factories and industrialization taking place in America. Third, improved transportation and communication. Development of a nationwide um, railroad had created a market for goods in national scale as well as encouraging mass production and consumption. Advanced technological inventions that generated greater productivity as they helped save labor. Friendly government policies supporting U.S. manufacturers with productive tariffs and subsidies. Genius entrepreneurs emerge, building huge industrial and commercial enterprises. All of the above have contributed to rapid industrialization and urbanization, with there being a large growth in cities. The technological achievements in industrialization had at the same time made agriculture so efficient that many farmers found themselves obsolete. As a result, a migration from rural to urban areas, coupled with an influx of immigrants in the late 19th century, ultimately shift the demographics of the country. Immigration. The US population had increased three times in the last half of 19th centuries in the last half of 19th century. This was fueled by the arrival of old and new immigrants in the US. The pushes that caused Europeans to immigrate in late 19th centuries are mechanizations of farm work made farmers jobless and poor. Second, overcrowding and high unemployment rates in some European cities. Third, religious persecution, especially Jews in Russia. The pulls for choosing to immigrate to US are: first, US reputations for democracy and religious freedom. Second, economic opportunities on the Great Plains and industrial jobs offered in US urban cities. Third, commonizations of transportation like steamships and ship passage in ships offer a glimmer of hope to the poor Europeans who wish to immigrate to the United States. The majority of all immigrants was composed of Protestant Europeans from the north and south. For example, these old immigrants could speak English and were highly educated and skilled, which made it easy for them to adapt into American society. However, things got a bit tough for the new immigrants in 1890s who came from Southern and Eastern Europe, such as the Italian, Poles, and Russians, as the majority of them could not speak English and was uneducated peasants who barely upheld any industrial skills. Unlike the old Protestant immigrants, these new immigrants were Roman Catholic and Jewish, which were deeply hated by the native-born Americans. As a result, these newcomers usually ended living in old ethnic neighborhoods in New York, Chicago, and other major cities, where diseases and pollutions from nearby factories were a commonplace. However, it was their arrival that facilitated urbanization in the US. The problems and effects of urbanization are immense. Generally, there are some good impacts and bad impacts that came along with growing cities and urban communities. We will first talk about good impacts, positive effects. First, new technologies, elevators, skyscrapers, lighting, water and sewage systems. Street light cities arose as now people who live far away from their working places travel to work on streetcars. This means that people no longer needed to walk to their working places, and offices or factories could be built even farther from residents. Skyscrapers were sky-piercing buildings that were made possible by new technologies such as the Otis elevator. The 10-story house insurance company was the first skyscrapers with a steel skeleton built by William Baron Janney in 1886. Um, Cultural benefits. Higher education. The number of U.S. colleges increased in the late 1800s thanks to the generous funds offered by some of the wealthiest philanthropists in the United States, such as Vanderbilt University, contributed by Vanderbilt himself. As a result, the United States successfully nurtured its scholars who would contribute significantly to more scientific discoveries and technological inventions. Many realist writers and painters also emerged from living in urban cities. Their writings capture the hectic life and bad living conditions in cities. William Dean Howells, a realist work, The Rise of Silas Lamham and a Hazard of New Fortunes, drew attention upon the negative effects of industrialization and fair wealth distribution. Music. The growth of cities led to an increasing demand for musical performance and entertainment as workers needed an outlet for their pent-up stress from work. By 1900, well-structured symphony orchestras, opera house became a norm in many urban cities in the United States. At the same time, new music such as jazz and blues were introduced and quickly liked by the people in early 1900s. Popular press. Newspaper served more as entertainment purposes to the public rather than delivering information. It became another form of stress relief for the working class living in fast-paced cities. Other leisure time activities also gained popularity among Americans in the late 19th century. People began to take interest in amateur sports like golf, tennis, horse riding, etc. Moving on to negative effects of urbanization. First, housing and health. To maximize their profits, landlords divided housing into cubicles with very limited personal space. This became known as the slums and tenements apartment. Later on, since the New York City had passed a law in 1879 that made having a window in each cubicle compulsory, dumbbell tenements were introduced. There were sanitation shafts built within the building to make sure there was a window in each room. The drawbacks on health were overcrowding and bad hygiene. Such problems arose from these new tenements promoted the spread of deadly diseases. Um, Working conditions, low wages. By 1900, two-thirds Americans work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week for the sake of earning wages to sustain their families. Since there was a large supply of cheap labor from immigrants who competed for jobs, wages were barely enough to afford basic necessities. Problems concerning with low wages were justified by David Ricardo. His theory of the iron law of wages stated that wages will never truly rise because they were subsistence. Every time workers get more money, they will have more kids, which leads to an increase in the working population, and ultimately created a vicious cycle in which money had to be split up even more. As a result, most wage earners could not support a family on one single income. This gave rise to child labor. Bad working conditions. Assembly line assigned just one step in the manufacturing process of a product to industrial workers. Performing semi-skilled tasks were tedious. Also, the working conditions in these factories were bad and dangerous. Workers were constantly exposed to chemicals and pollutants which put their health at risk. Political machines, corruption. Urban political machines were a common trend in American cities in the late 19th century. They are political parties formed by a group of politicians and were headed by a boss, aka the leader, who gave orders and dispensed government jobs to his loyal supporters. These parties usually rewarded its followers both rich and the poor in the forms of business favors and employment opportunities. For example, Tammany Hall in New York City was a political machine notorious for giving out favors like providing jobs or housing to the immigrants or coordinating needs of businesses in exchange for their votes on the election day. Though these political machines usually provided support for the urban newcomers, they were greedy and they stole millions from the taxpayers. Such urban problems arose from living in cities has spiked a new enthusiasm for reforms. Back to immigration. The newcomers had renewed nativist feelings in native born Americans as they took away their jobs in the cities. This led to an increasing press for restriction on immigration in the U.S. First, Immigration Acts of 1882 restricted people considered as undesirable, especially those who had committed crimes or simply physically unable to contribute to the labor force. Second, another law in 1885 prohibited um, contract labor in order to protect American workers. Third, new arrivals of immigrants faced increasing difficulties as they had to pass even more harsh medical examinations and pay an entry tax before getting an approval to immigrate to the U.S. This anti-immigrant, never mind. Culturally, literature gave the reform-minded young men and women alike to address urban problems. There were books written to criticize the society and highlight some of the urban problems. Henry George, a San Francisco journalist, wrote a bestseller book that inspired readers to begin judging and discussing the drawbacks of laissez-faire capitalism. His books drew attention to the inequalities in wealth caused by industrialization. These provocative books had significant impacts as they helped bring about the reform movements. They also encouraged anti laissez faire economics feelings among American society and caused people to press for more government regulation in the market. Settlement houses. Some idealistic members of the middle class learned about the actual problems of immigrants and the underprivileged from living in the immigrants' neighborhoods. After experiencing the inhumane living conditions in these neighborhoods, they created and worked in settlement houses, which provided social services such as teaching English, industrial skills to immigrants, and providing kindergarten education. Um, Social Gospel, 1880 to 1900. The social gospel was a Protestant effort to relieve the effects of poverty among the urban poor. It basically stated and stressed the importance of applying Christian values to social problems. Water, water, Ranger Burst is a New York minister who led the social gospel movement. He wrote many books inspiring people to help the poor and attack urban problems. Women's suffrage. The first women's suffrage efforts began at Seneca Falls in 1848. Such issue was usually taken up by women from the middle class. Among them, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony of New York found the National American Woman Suffrage in 1890 with the ultimate goal of women suffrage and role in politics. There were a few successes in women's suffrage efforts. The Wyoming became the first state to grant women voting rights in 1869. Second, some states granted women suffrage but limited it to only local elections. They also granted women property rights, which allowed them to own property after marriage by 1900. Temperance and morality. Um, Women were the main advocates for temperance movement because they were usually the victims of alcohol-induced violence and well aware of the fact that excessive consumption of alcohol by male factory workers often led to poor working performance and poverty. They founded the Women Christian Temperance Union under the leadership of Frances E. Willard and the Anti-Saloon League in 1892, which evolved into a political force in 1916 as it successfully convinced 21 states to shut down all bars and saloons. Morales founded the Society for the Suppression of Vice to oversee morals in America. The society was founded by Anthony Comstock and his followers. Their success was seen in the passage of Comstock Law in 1873 in the Congress, which prohibited the mailing or transportation of obscene material, and photographs. Reforms in education. Public schools. New compulsory laws made it mandatory for parents to send their children to public schools. This caused literacy rates to rise to 90% of American population by 1900, with more people being educated. There was also a growing support for extending the tax to cover public high school. Reforms in working conditions. First is National Labor Union, which is the first attempt to organize all workers in all states, both farmers and urban workers. They founded the National Labor Union in 1866, which pushed for high wages and 8-hour workday for workers alike. The success was seen winning the 8-hour day for workers employed by the federal government, but they lost support which when depression kicked in 1873, and after a series of unsuccessful strikes in 1877, which caused a shift in American public opinion against them. Second, the Knights of Labor is the second national labor unions founded under Terence V. Powderly, the leader in 1869. He championed solving labor conflicts peacefully through arbitrations instead of strikes. The reforms the union advocated are first, establishing worker cooperatives. Second is the abolition of child labor, trusts, and monopolies. Um, Summary. Urbanization had both its positive effects and negative effects. The positive effects are new technologies and cultural benefits such as higher education. The negative effects are bad housing, working conditions, and political corruption. The reforms that serve to offset these urban problems are immigration restriction laws, which made immigrating to the states even more difficult. Literature critics for the cultural aspect. Settlement house to help the new immigrants to adjust to the U.S. life. Social gospel that champion social injustice for the social justice for the poor. Women suffrage reforms in voting rights. Temperance movement which curb alcohol consumption. And the last, improving working conditions for workers.